Every revolution starts in the minds of the people.
Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Tuesday, January 28th, and I'm still representing my Buffalo Bills. It was a sad weekend, not completely unexpected. Great season for a team that was in a rebuilding year to get to the AFC Championship. Definitely didn't have the defense, although the defense did step up. And, well, we'll get to my thoughts on the Bills on some other day, because today I want to talk about something really exciting. And of course, when I say that, it's always about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. Now, I know that doesn't sound exciting on its face, but there's something that I've been following for quite a while now. I guess it would be years, that is coming to a head. And I actually heard one other financial expert, well, I shouldn't say other, I'm not a financial expert, but I heard a financial expert mention this in an interview in passing, and I'm going to try to get him on the show to share his thoughts. But it has to do with monetary policy since COVID and the reverse repo market. Now, longtime listeners of the show will remember Tom Luongo and his appearances here. He's from the Golds, Goats, and Guns podcast and website, and he has his ideas about what the reverse repo market means for the broader economy, for the money supply, for financial markets. And he may be 100% right in his theories. I tend to be a little bit more, the simplest explanation is probably closest to the truth, but I don't know. But let's get into this, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about. It might sound a little mysterious at first, but the general narrative has been that we had COVID and Jerome Powell dropped interest rates to zero, which traditionally has always meant a large increase in the money supply. That's not really true anymore, and we'll get into that just enough to clarify what I'm about to say. But so he unleashes this $6 trillion tsunami of money, 5.9, I think it was altogether, that the balance sheet increased from the beginning of COVID till its peak sometime in 2021, I believe, or 2022. And then at a certain point, he said, well, it's time that we start raising interest rates and reducing our balance sheet. Now, I'm going to do this as quickly as I can, but it used to be the case up until 2008 that reducing the balance sheet and raising interest rates were the same thing. Because the way that the Fed reduces its balance sheet, one of two ways. One, it allows the bonds it's holding or the mortgage-backed securities now, since they hold those two, to simply retire. There's constantly money coming in, paying down those loans, and at some point they're paid off. And if the Fed doesn't buy more of them as fast as they're retiring, then its balance sheet will shrink. I mean, it can also sell these back to its member banks, and that's traditionally what it would do when it was trying to so-called tighten. It would be selling securities to its member banks. That means it's getting cash out of its member banks, so out of the banking system. So it's making money more scarce to the banking system, and therefore, if you want to borrow it, then you're going to have to pay a higher interest rate. Just supply and demand. There's less money around, so it costs more to borrow. That's how it always worked up until 2008. And so you were reducing the money supply and raising the interest rate at the same time. Conversely, if you wanted to lower the interest rate, you would buy those securities from your member banks. Now, the member banks don't have a choice in this matter. So you'd buy the securities from your member banks and they would receive cash that the Fed just created out of thin air for these securities that the Fed was buying. And then because the banking system had more money in it, the cost of money would go down, supply and demand. Greater supply, lower cost. So to borrow money, the cost of that borrowing, the interest rate would be lower. So what happened in 2008 is they went through that process and they did a very large scale buying that they called quantitative easing, if you remember. This was a new term back then. And what the member banks did was, I mean, they were all in trouble because they had gone long on these mortgage-backed securities. And the Fed bought those from them too. They had only ever bought government paper before that, either treasury bonds or bills or all the different little loan instruments that the Treasury creates, starting from these little short-term bills all the way up to 30-year bonds. So it was the case up until 2008 that that's all the Fed bought was government bonds or government loans. And then because of this mortgage-backed security crisis, the Fed started buying mortgage-backed securities, and that's really like a bailout. So they were bailing out banks so that now the Fed owns these things, and the banks, you get them off their balance sheet, and the Fed is buying them at definitely above what the market price would be, because probably the market price during that panic is close to zero. Nobody wants these securities because so many people are defaulting on their mortgages. So that all happened in 2008 and 9, early 2009. And because it was such a huge operation by the Fed and the banks were so spooked by the financial crisis, they accumulated these large reserves that they had never had before at the Federal Reserve. I mean, basically, it used to be the Fed's so-called balance sheet. There were no reserves, okay? And there still aren't. The Fed still doesn't have any reserves. When they are given a payment, that money just disappears. And when they buy something, they're just creating that money. But the banks themselves, the member banks, built up these large reserves. And so from that point on, when the Fed wanted to, let's say, lower the interest rate, they would no longer have to buy securities from the member banks. They could just lower the rate of interest they were paying the banks on these reserves that now existed. So what does that do? It kind of separates the Fed's direct effect on the money supply from its direct effect on interest rates. Now, remember, it's all indirect. So the Fed is never just ordering banks to charge higher or lower interest rates. But what it's doing is, in the old days, by manipulating supply and demand, or now by changing what it pays those banks on their own reserves, it's influencing them indirectly. So, let's say it's paying 2% on the bank's reserves. Well, that bank is not going to lend money out to the market at less than 2% because it can get 2% from the Fed at no risk at all. So it's going to lend at something higher than that to the rest of the market. Even these overnight loans, what you hear the federal funds rate, that's the rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans that usually are done to comply with things like reserve ratios, although those are gone too now, but at least for the moment. But for other reasons, to keep their balance sheets tidy, banks are always lending each other money overnight, and they may have cash obligations the next day. And, a bank in general, but in any case, if the Fed then, under this new system, wants to lower the interest rate, it doesn't necessarily need to buy any securities from its member banks. It just lowers that rate, let's say, from 2% to 1%. Okay. And that means that the member banks now are only getting 1% from the Fed. And whereas they wouldn't loan each other or the market at 2% before because they could get it from the Fed, now they have an incentive to lower their market rates to 2%. That's an oversimplified explanation, but that's basically how it works. So what happened in 2008 was that controlling the money supply by the Fed and controlling interest rates got separated. They're two different things. So, and most people seem to still talk about lowering interest rates as if that means they're printing money, and it doesn't. Okay. So that's one thing you just kind of have to understand. So the Fed raised rates dramatically up to 5.5%, basically back to where they used to raise them to 20 years ago. Of course, 40 years ago, they raised them to almost 20%, but those days have been long gone. And long term, rates have been falling for the past 40 years. And the big question has been, is that period of falling rates over? And there's a lot of fundamental reasons why it should be, with all the governments borrowing all this money and the US debt going from just, at the beginning of this century, somewhere around 5 trillion to 30 trillion today. So during this cycle with COVID, of course, they lowered rates to zero, but they also printed a lot of money. So those two things used to be one and the same. They did both at the same time. But here's the thing that they did. Not long after Powell printed that $5 trillion, he raised the award rate of the reverse repo market, the overnight reverse repurchase agreements. So what that is if you are a bank or financial institution that needs a treasury bond for any reason, and again, this just goes to this short-term balancing your balance sheet out or whatever. There is this mechanism where you can go to the Fed and buy a treasury from it for a very short period of time, anywhere from 24 hours to 2 weeks. And they call it repo. This is the reverse repo. And it's reverse because there's something called the repo market where you sell a treasury to the Fed and you get cash. That's more like borrowing money from the Fed. Well, in this case, you're lending money to the Fed, really, which is kind of, seems nonsensical, but basically you're getting this treasury for whatever technical reason. And of course, the balance of this market is usually close to zero or zero. And with the reverse repo, you are buying this treasury from the Fed for maybe 24 hours, maybe 2 weeks. With the repo part of it is there's an agreement that the Fed will buy it back the next day or in 2 weeks, whatever the term of that is. So think about what's happening there. I'm the bank. I have money that's part of the official money supply that's available to the general market. I can lend it out, and I take some small amount of that and I buy a treasury from the Fed. Now I'm holding a US treasury and the Fed is holding my money, okay, with a promise to buy it back tomorrow. So for that period where the Fed has it, the money supply has gone down a little bit. I mean, infinitesimally negligible, whatever, in most cases. And then it goes back up to where it was. That money is back in the money supply the next day or 2 weeks later when the Fed fulfills its obligation to purchase that security back and I get my cash back. And again, as I said, this is normally done for technical reasons. There's negligible balance or total money involved in this market, but it is basically money that's tied up. And let me get back to that in a moment, because what happened in 2021 was the Fed then raised the award rate for these repurchase agreements. They started raising it in 2021 from basically zero all the way up to, I believe it was 4.5 or 5%. I'll look right now. And so a whole bunch of money started flowing into this reverse repo market where there never had been balances like this before. In fact, when it peaked, there was actually over $2 trillion tied up in the reverse repo market. Now, I want to make something clear that you hear sometimes, oh, the Fed printed all this money, but it just went into the stock market or it just went into real estate. And that's a kind of a fallacy. Money never goes into the stock market. If I sell you a stock or I buy one from you, money goes from my checking account to yours or yours to mine. Okay. So Murphy, who's an economist and can explain this 6 ways from Sunday, could explain it a lot better than I can. But basically, what I just said is true. Money is never in anything. It always is just transferred from one account to the other. But in the case of the reverse repo market, that's not true. I mean, technically, it's going to the Fed's checking account, but the Fed doesn't have a checking account. So when you give money to the Fed, that money is destroyed. It goes out of existence for that 24 hours or 2 weeks, and then it's recreated when it's put back in your account. And the security that you bought from the Fed or, bought on loan or whatever you want to call that under repo conditions goes back to the Fed. So in this case, this does truly tie up cash that could otherwise be out there being loaned in the economy or put to some use in the economy. So what really happened after 2020 was the Fed does this $5 trillion tsunami and and lowers interest rates to zero, but they immediately start pulling back 2 trillion of the 5. So it was really only a $3 trillion tsunami, which is still a lot, but it wasn't anywhere near what it initially looked like. So you got 2 trillion of the 5 just bouncing back and forth between the Fed and these dealers who are there now because there's real yield there. This was only a technical thing before, but when the Fed's got interest rates at zero, it causes all kinds of problems for people like the money market and anyone else looking for yield off super safe investments. They're getting lower rates on everything. So they go here and they can get some yield where maybe they can't get it anywhere else or can't get as much. So you've got this 2 trillion tied up, right? And that peaks in, looks like December of 2022. And it basically levels off until May of 2023. And these don't line up. By the way, these award rate raises and lowers don't exactly line up with the beginnings of rises and decreases in the reverse repo market. And hopefully the guest I want to bring on, if it's important, we can get into the mechanics of that. But basically, the Fed started lowering the award rate and money started to come out of the reverse repo market. So the Fed announces that, okay, we've got inflation almost back to where we want it. Now, of course, that whole narrative is, we should have deflation the way they define it all the time. I mean, prices should always be falling because we're always making more and more stuff more efficiently and becoming more productive. So, and inflation is the creation of new money. It's not rising prices, but they define it as rising prices. So let's say price inflation, they declare that even though it's not back to 2%, even today, as I'm recording this, they say they've made all this progress and therefore they're going to start lowering interest rates again. And they're going to start shrinking their balance sheet. So or let me correct that. So they had announced after they had raised their balance sheet, they were going to start lowering it. And they did. their balance sheet peaked at 8.9 trillion, and they started allowing assets to roll off their balance sheet. They never went out and sold securities to the member banks, which would suck cash a lot faster out of the economy, because you go sell, let's say they sold $1 trillion, that would pull $1 trillion out of the economy. But what they said they would do is let it go by attrition. So I said at the beginning of this that if they don't buy new securities fast enough, then the ones they already have are constantly being paid off and therefore just rolling off. And the money coming in to the Fed is just kind of just being destroyed, bleeped out of existence, because it's paid to the Fed, and the Fed doesn't bother to keep an account, since this is all just fiat money. So the Fed, between the time they announced they were going to start decreasing their balance sheet and and started raising interest rates, so the lowering of interest rates would have the opposite effect. But they've decreased their balance sheet from 8.9 trillion to about 6.8 trillion, or about $2.1 trillion. So they raised it from 4 to almost 9, and then they decreased it to just under 7, right? But while they've been decreasing their balance sheet, while they've been letting money come out of the economy and flow into the Fed where it's destroyed, the money that had been tied up in the reverse repo market started flowing out of the reverse repo market. So the reverse repo market balance peaked at 2 trillion. And starting around May of 2023, it started dropping. And coordinated with this, the Fed had started paying lower rates, a lower award rate on these repurchase agreements. So it's like, you buy a treasury from the Fed, and you're like loaning them money, and they pay you back like an interest rate. So both that award rate started dropping, the money starts flowing out of the reverse repo market, where it's just kind of bouncing back and forth daily or weekly between these member banks and the Fed. And it's going back, into the economy. It's going back to be put to use by the people who were previously just drawing this interest rate off of the reverse repo market. And coincidentally, the entire reduction in the Fed's balance sheet is almost exactly the same amount of money that has flowed out of the reverse repo market. So in a way, there was a stealth tightening during the initial inflation around COVID. We printed 5, but we tied up 2 in the reverse repo market. But since they started reducing their balance sheet, there's been a stealth easing that the amount of money that they reduced in the economy and base money by allowing their balance sheet to go down, same amount of money has flowed out of the reverse repo market. So it's gone from 2 trillion to right now it is at 92 billion. So under 100 billion. Okay, 2 trillion is 2,000 billion, and now it's around 92 billion. So we're getting close to the point where the reverse repo market stealth easing, money flowing out of it, is going to be over. And that's where the Fed has to make a decision. Is it going to continue to reduce its balance sheet? Now, way back in 2008, when its balance sheet was 800 billion and it took it up over 4 trillion, they said they were going to unwind all of that. Yeah, we're going to go, this is once in a lifetime. We'll never do this again. And we'll eventually, reduce our balance sheet back to somewhere around where it is now, maybe a little higher. Of course, they never did that. The time came when it was around 4.4 trillion during the first Trump administration, and they got it down to 3.7. And now that I remember, even before COVID, it was already back to 4.1. So that was the big effort to reduce the balance sheet. It went down like 700 billion, and then it gave back 400 billion of that before they ever even did COVID. And then they printed 5 trillion, took it up to 8.9. So, it's never going back to where it was. And during this time, during COVID, when they increased by 5 trillion, the money supply is as measured by M2. Now, that's the real kind of money supply that's available to most market participants. That went from 15 trillion to 22 trillion. So, for everyone who understands how the monetary system works, this is kind of elementary, but the Fed creates what they call as base money, and they also have a base money index you can look at. It roughly coincides with the Fed's balance sheet. And then once the banks get it, so if they get money, they can lend out, most of the money that they have on deposit. So if you deposit $100, the bank can lend out whatever is not required to keep their reserve ratio, which I believe is still around zero. But let's say it was 10%, you deposit 100, the bank lends out 90, and $10 of your money is still there, but the whole 100 is still available for you to withdraw the next day, even though they've lent out 90 to somebody else. So the banks themselves increase the money supply. And then, wherever that money is lent, it goes into someone's checking account, and 90% of that can be lent out. Now, again, like during COVID, they eliminated reserve requirements completely. And I think they gave us the reason these big reserves that the banks had at the Federal Reserve parked there. So they may be lending still 100% of everything out all the time. But in any case, there's always more money in circulation or available in people's checking accounts than the Fed has actually created, because the banks create money too in the process of lending. And then when a loan gets paid back, then that money is destroyed, so to speak. And same when it's paid back into the Fed. So in any case, the money supply increases to 22 trillion. Now, during this easing, MEM2 went down, and a lot of people made a big deal about this, but it really did not go down very much. And in fact, I meant to have this chart up. Let's see if I can get it without freezing myself again. But I think it went down like $1.5 trillion, if I'm not mistaken. I'll tell you. So there was this big, increase during the initial tsunami that peaked at 21.8 trillion, and then it went down to 20.6 trillion. Now, again, remember in 2020, it was 15. Then it goes to almost 22. Then it's down to 20 and a half. Well, it's already back up to 21.4. So to me, not real impressive. The fact that it was going down for the first time in decades, everyone was making a big deal about this, but in the great scheme of things, to me, most of the tsunami is still out there. And even though the direction of the Fed had been to decrease the base money supply by letting their balance sheet go down, they were at the same time, or they weren't doing it, but this money's flowing out of the reverse repo market. So there is no real easing going on. There's really no tightening going on. You have the Fed tightening and the reverse repo market, so to speak, easing the same amount, dollar for dollar. So basically, we got a 5 minus 3 or 5 minus 2. So a $5 trillion increase in base money with $2 trillion of it tied up in reverse repo. And then we got a $2 trillion decrease by the Fed with the $2 trillion that was parked in reverse repo flowing back to the economy. So basically nothing has happened with the money supply, the base money supply, since the Fed started reducing its balance sheet in, when was that? June of 2022, it looks like. Somewhere in there, it started going down, and it went down trillions, basically $2 trillion. At the same time, $2 trillion flowed out of the reverse repo market. So the overall money supply did not change, base money. And as you could see that the fluctuation since the initial increase in M2 hardly changed at all by a much smaller percentage than advertised. So in the meantime, the Fed started lowering rates, the interest rate. And again, this is represented as easing, and it is. But when they lower the interest rate, really, they're only now controlling the behavior of banks, or trying to affect the behavior of banks with the money that's available. They're not changing the amount of money that's available just by lowering the interest rate, because they're two separate processes, as I've said. And to the extent that the Fed has been lowering the interest rate while also letting its balance sheet decrease, those two things are like working in opposite directions. So they're, on one hand, they're encouraging banks to lend more money, but on the other hand, they're taking away money that's available to the banks to lend. But they're not really, because, again, money's flowing out of the reverse repo market. So they are easing, but not like they used to, where they're, like in 2020 when they poured all this new money into the economy. So it's really kind of schizophrenic. Europe did something like this last year or the year before, where on one hand they're lowering interest rates, on the other hand they're supposedly reducing their balance sheet. Or I think they did it the opposite way. They were raising interest rates, but they were also raising their balance sheets. So they're putting more money out there, but then they're trying to this is what happens when you get to the end game where there's no good answer. That's kind of my argument, that this is kind of schizophrenia. But the bottom line is that this free ride to reduce their balance sheet, the Fed, is over, because there's no more money tied up in the reverse repo market. There's $92 billion more. So they could take their balance sheet from 6.8 down to 6.7 maybe trillion dollars. And at that point, well, what are they going to do? Are they going to just freeze, just like hold their balance sheet there, way higher than it was just 4 years ago, like 50% higher, more than that percent higher, really, maybe 3 trillion higher, about somewhere around there? Are they going to let it keep reducing? Now, if they keep letting those bonds roll off without buying new ones fast enough to offset the roll off, then they will finally start really removing dollars from the economy. And that will, of course, have a negative effect on the economy that's so addicted to, the new money that's been created. Or they could just reverse and start increasing their balance sheet. And then they basically just said they've lost all credibility then, because now they're just creating new money when they haven't even got their inflation rate down to 2%, their price inflation rate. So I think they're going to be in a real jam. I think this is like a reckoning that's coming. Now, I could be wrong, and that's why I want to get some other voices on here. But you're seeing the market getting jittery right now, and that could be for a lot of reasons. But is it because, the smart money knows something is coming here? The Fed could lower interest rates to zero, but if it keeps taking money out of the economy, then although it has encouraged the banks to lend at very low interest rates, it's taking away the money that they would use to make those loans. Okay, there would still be some, but you got two counteracting forces. You have lower supply of money, which means that should make interest rates go up. And then you have them, putting the downward pressure on rates by lowering the rate they're paying the banks at their reserves. And the other thing we should keep in mind is that the flows don't all go to the same people. Where that money is coming out of the reverse repo market and going might not be the same as where it would go if the Fed were making money supply adjustments with the open market operations. So you got something happening. This $2 trillion unwind of the reverse repo market is almost over. Okay. It was at 2.2 trillion at the peak in 2000 up until about 2023, May, April, May. And since then, okay, so for almost the past 2 years, that money has been flowing out of the reverse repo market and it's almost gone. So the Fed has been able to reduce its balance sheet, which and beat its chest like it's tightening while this has been happening, and no one's watching it really, and doing the stealth easing at the same time. So now that's over. It's almost over. It's going to be over within months. I mean, a month. I'm not sure. And then the Fed's got to decide what it's going to do as far as the money supply goes. And that if they start, letting it, if they start buying again and increasing the base money supply again, it's going to bring on more what everyone calls inflation, which is prices going up. If it continues to let it go down, then it's going to suck money out of the economy and likely produce, the crash that a lot of people think has been coming for a long time. And then maybe they could just stand pat with their balance sheet at 6.7 or so trillion, which means it's like, okay, it's going up from there after that. So we had this another one of these, yeah, we're going to increase it short term and then unwind it, and it never happens. And of course, that's hugely damaging to the Fed's credibility, and that's a permanent devaluation of the dollar. And of course, other currencies might be devaluing themselves faster to make the dollar look strong in things like the dollar index. They're just comparing to other fiat currencies that are even worse. But it's devaluing the dollar in the real sense and what it can buy in real commodities. So we'll see. I think, we're going to find out something about this over the next couple quarters and maybe this quarter. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of event, early in the Trump administration, if there's any political maneuvering by these people or timing of these kinds of things, then of course it wouldn't surprise me that they would want to upset the Trump administration with some kind of financial crisis. But really, it's coming no matter what, because things are coming to a head. The debt is out of control. Now you're in this box now. You either get very tough and continue to decrease the money supply and start raising interest rates again, and then you kill the economy, or you start easing all over the place, interest rates and money supply, and you bring back, the higher price inflation, maybe even worse than what we saw in the last few years. So yeah, may you live in interesting times, right? None of this is any good for, you and me, other than the fact that it could bring on, some kind of reckoning where, somebody's forced into more responsibility. Most likely, what they will do is just try to inflate the problems away, get away with people, try to keep price inflation, even though it's hurting people. Like they don't have the pitchforks out yet. And I guess that's probably the plan, right? Is we'll try to inflate our way out of this. Inflate meaning create more money to pay all these debts we don't have, and try to do it in a way where they don't, they don't come after us with the torches and the rope. Not a great plan, but what do you expect, right? What have they done well in your lifetime? So interesting. We'll see. I'll keep you updated on bringing the guest on that I was talking about. The only one I've heard mention this on any of the financial shows. I don't have cable, so I'm getting all this off of webcasts, but these in some cases webcasts of TV productions, and we'll see. And if you've got comments about this, I'd love to hear them. Make sure you put them in the comments on the show notes page so all the other people can hear it. And of course, what I always forget to say at the top of the show, make sure you like this episode, subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, and share it with a friend. Forward on the show notes page to a friend, someone who doesn't know about the podcast. Let's continue to grow it. Took a little dip during my business venture in 2023, but it's on the way back up again. So thank you for everyone who's returned to the subscription list. Thank you to all the new members. And as I said, make sure you tell somebody about this. If you tell one new person a week, then we'll have a much bigger community to talk with and get comments from. So thanks again.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.